It's a debate that's raging across the country in just the past day or so. Demonstrations have been held on the campus of UNC Chapel Hill. Confederate statues in Charlottesville, Virginia have been covered up with shrouds. A Confederate statue in a cemetery in Columbus, Ohio was vandalized, as was the statue of Christopher Columbus here in Baltimore. And in Houston, Texas, a man was arrested after he was accused of trying to blow up a Confederate statue. Nothing quite that dramatic has happened in our region just yet, but the conversations in and around Boston are heating up. There's that Confederate monument on George's Island, brought to us by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the 1960s, which has since been boarded up. But beyond that, there are new questions about whether it's time to revisit the name of Yawkey Way, which honors former Red Sox owner Thomas Yawkey, who was notoriously slow to integrate his team, or Faneuil Hall, named after Peter Faneuil, who had ties to the slave trade. And what about that statue of the controversial Christopher Columbus that sits in the North End? They are all issues up for debate, and last night President Donald Trump came down firmly on one side.
Does anybody want George Washington's statue? To Lincoln, to Teddy Roosevelt. I see they want to take Teddy Roosevelt's down too. They're trying to figure out why. They don't know. They're trying to take away our culture. They're trying to take away our history.
Joining me to discuss are Kevin Peterson, founder of the New Democracy Coalition, a nonprofit focused on civic action and social change, Heather Cox Richardson, a political historian and professor of history at Boston College, and Renee Graham, columnist with the Boston Globe. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for being here.
Renee, let me start with you. It seems to me that the president in that clip, in his own inimitable way, was asking a question that I think a lot of people might also be wondering about. Once you start taking down historical monuments, where do you stop? What do you think the answer should be?
Well, you know, I think it's sort of a false idea to come up with this idea, well, if you take down Robert E. Lee, then you've got to take down George Washington. What I think is important is to understand the history behind these figures. You know, maybe the issue isn't even taking them down. Maybe it's to change the wording on them to really explain who Robert E. Lee was. He wasn't just this great general. He was a general of a treasonous army that was trying to sustain slavery and to tear the country in two. So maybe that's what the monuments need to say. Maybe taking them down isn't even the answer necessarily, but really explaining the full history behind these figures.
So you're okay with the recontextualization approach? Provide more information than is currently there while allowing memorials that might be problematic in some way to continue standing?
I mean, do I think we need 1,500 Robert E. Lee statues around the country? No, I don't. But if you're going to have these statues, and let's face it, not every one of them is going to come down, I think there is room to be true about the history.
All right, Heather Cox Richardson, what's your personal criteria for what monuments are problematic and which ones, even if they are problematic, should not be gotten rid of?
Well, I think what Renee says is really important, that you can't lump them all together as these people were involved in the slave trade or slavery or racism, therefore they all have to go. Personally, I don't want any Confederate statues anywhere because those were treasonous people who tried to destroy America. I don't know of any other country that honors the people who tried to destroy its country. That's very different than the Founding Fathers, who came at a very different time when many people were involved in the slave trade or in practices that women nowadays would find offensive, or Native Americans or Chinese Americans. That's something that needs to be contextualized. And then you come to something like Yawkey Way. That's something that's paid for by taxpayer dollars today, and I think how we honor those things today are very different. So I would look at all these things slightly differently.
Let's get back to Yawkey Way in a second, but I want Kevin's take because I think he is maybe a little more rigid, and I don't mean that in a negative way in terms of his criteria. What's the argument for renaming Faneuil Hall and also maybe reassessing, as you suggested in a piece earlier this year, Winthrop Square in downtown Boston, and this monument to former Mayor Theodore Lyman, who was mayor in the 1830s in Dorchester? What's problematic about those?
Well, what's problematic is that none of those statues or monuments reflect the whole truth of our American history, our democratic history, our city's history, because they are myopic in a very real sense. I don't think that an African-American visiting Faneuil Hall, who's knowledgeable about her history, can walk by Faneuil Hall without, in some ways, being insulted that this building is being lauded as a celebrated civic space.
Okay, tell me why. I think I know the answer.
Well, because the foundations, the very foundations of the building were paid for. And I mean the stone foundations were paid for through the sale of a slave boy by Peter Faneuil, who later donated the structure to the city of Boston. That's an odious history to embrace, to celebrate. I think that if we are going to move more inclusive and embrace democracy more robustly, we need to know the full truth. And some of that requires us doing some examination of our past, but also reconceptualizing, and in this instance of Faneuil Hall, renaming it so that all of us can be proud to walk in that building.
Why rename as opposed to putting up a very prominent display at Faneuil Hall saying the foundation for this building was paid for by the sale of a child who was a slave?
Because I think the country and the city of Boston needs to make big statements, big symbolic statements, big metaphorical statements about where we come from and how we develop. And I don't agree that all statues should come down. Many of them should. But here is a important civic space, not only for this city, but for the country. 18 million people visited the city Faneuil Hall 2 years ago. It's lauded by the whole country. So if we're going to make some serious have some serious discussion about race, here is an instance where we can begin the conversation, and that means that we have to encounter our history with truthfulness.
Let me ask you and also Renee and Heather about another potentially problematic memorial. John Winthrop, who was the first governor of Massachusetts, founded First Church even before he and his colleagues founded the Commonwealth. There's a statue of him right now in front of First Church. I think it was a statue designed in the 1870s. You flag Winthrop Square as potentially negative because John Winthrop was a slave owner. I'd love to get each of your takes on whether that statue in front of First Church should be recontextualized, should be taken away to some other location, or should just be allowed to stand as it is right now. What do you think?
I think every circumstance is different. But I do think there's something to be said for looking at who these men were and the fact that they were slave owners. It's the ways that we've hidden that. It says a lot about the ways we deal with history in this nation. We're constantly cleaning things up. So suddenly you hold up John Winthrop as this wonderful figure, and nowhere is it mentioned, unless you go to look for it, that he was a slave owner and the ways that he benefited from the slave trade. I think it's important to, I agree with what Heather said. There should be no Confederate statues. But I do think contextualizing is important. The issue I have sometimes with completely removing a statue is you get to just sort of wipe that history away, which to a degree, which is what they've been doing all these years to begin with. So at least if there's something there that addresses who this person was, the full story, as much as you can get on a plaque, I think that's important. I think people should be able to walk up to Faneuil Hall or to Winthrop Square and know who these men really were.
Heather, hop in.
That's what worries me, is that if we wipe them all clean, what we lose is that American history has reality. It has a history. And that if you take that away, we don't know in 100 years what people are going to need to find in that history then. So it's much more important to me to take John Winthrop, not only his attitudes, by the way, toward African Americans, but also toward women, and contextualize that and say, this is who we are, this is where we came from, the bad as well as the good.
But we don't know mostly about these men, these Confederate soldiers, through viewing their statues. We learn about them in the history books. And that's where they should be sent, into the history books, on the internet, or even into museums where young people, next generation, can come and reflect on them that way. As they are now, they stand as ugly representations of an ugly past.
You said that in reference to Confederate statues, but we only have, to the best of my knowledge, that one Confederate memorial in Boston. So what about someone like John Winthrop, who engaged in, he was a slave-owning theocrat. We wouldn't be big fans of his MO today if he were around, but he lived, almost 400 years ago, and he was the first governor of Massachusetts. What do you think should happen with that statue?
Well, there's an instance where contextualization may be appropriate.
All right, I want to get your take on a couple others, because this is, it is much bigger than just the Confederate memorial question. There's a statue of Abraham Lincoln in Park Square in downtown Boston, which commemorates his emancipation of the nation's slaves. It's a copy of the statue that's in Washington, D.C. There's an African-American in a subservient position. The sculptor actually would not allow an African-American model in his home. He found it so troubling. Again, I'd love to get each of you to weigh in on this particular memorial and whether you think it should stay, go, or be augmented.
Should there be statues to Abraham Lincoln in this nation? Of course. Should there be a statue of Abraham Lincoln with a black person on their knees before Father Abe? No. You know, Lincoln also had a very complicated history when it came to slavery and emancipation. And the idea of sort of positioning him as this savior and this messiah, you know, helping this poor, miserable black person, there's really just no place for that statue anymore. It's an embarrassing and demeaning statue.
Really briefly, what do you think?
It is the history of its own era. That statue is a history of its own era, not of Abraham Lincoln. I
agree with Renee. It's a position of subservience and inferiority. That statue should go.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I wish we could talk for 30 more minutes. Kevin Peterson, Heather Cox Richardson, Renee Grant, thank you all.